Hello YouTube, this is Frank from Happy Coder, and today in this video I'd like to talk to you about a JavaScript library called Highcharts, which is mainly used for data visualization and, to be more specific, generating dynamic interactive charts for all kinds of data visualization purposes. And in my workplace, I have been working with this library for a while now, and in my humble opinion, I really prefer this library over the traditional C3D3 data visualization library. And today's topic is going to cover how to generate custom legend buttons for the stack bar chart, which is a component in the Highcharts library. And without further ado, let me just show you a very brief demo about what we are going to do today, and we will just delve right into today's content. All right, let me quickly demo what we're going to do today. So as you can see, we have a stack bar chart component that is being generated from the React-Highchart library. These three radio buttons you see right here are the default legend controls that comes from the stack bar chart component. And the objective of today's video is going to show you guys how to build these three custom-made legend buttons, because the problem with these default legend buttons is that you can't really customize how they look. And with that said, let's take a look at how to build the custom legend buttons. Alright guys, so as I have mentioned before, the objective of today's video is to create custom legends for a Highcharts component in our React project. So after we have set up our project using create React app, we cd into that folder. Now we're just going to focus on bringing up a Highchart instance in our browser. So basically we're going to create a custom component for a stack bar chart instance using the Highchart React-Official wrapper for the Highcharts library, and we're just going to render that custom component within our app.js. So now let's try just to install the necessary dependencies for this project. So one thing we're gonna need is React-Highcharts. And make sure that you don't install just the Highchart. Make sure that you install this React-Highcharts, which is a wrapper around the official Highcharts library. So we're gonna do npm I React-Highcharts. And the other necessary dependency that we would need is the Highcharts React-Official package. And when you look at their brief documentation, you will notice that they're going to refer to the Highcharts React as the base component that they're going to render. And this Highcharts reference that is being passed into the Highcharts React component is actually the React Highcharts dependency that we are just about to install. So aside from React Highcharts, we're gonna do Highcharts React Official. Now while we're installing the npm dependencies, now let's try to clean up the project a little bit. Let's get rid of logo, and let's also clean up the render method, meaning that we don't need anything other than just the div that has a class name of app. Looks like the dependencies have all been installed, and now let's go and look for an example for Highcharts stack bar chart component. So let's look for Highcharts stack bar chart. And we're going to use this one as our base template. And all we're going to do today is going to, first of all, disabling this default legend that is baked into the chart. And we're going to add our own spin to the chart to the extent that when we're clicking our own custom legends, we're still going to see this animation, but building our own custom legends is going to give us the power to make the legend look however we want, instead of having to deal with these default style of the legend, which is not very aesthetic. So what we're going to do is that we're going to click on view options and copy this entire configuration object for the high chart, and we're gonna save it. Let's create a new directory called utils, which stands for utilities, and we're going inside of utils we're going to create a file called, let's name it config obj.js, which stands for configuration object. We don't necessarily need to commit it to the Git repository, so we're going to click cancel, and let's do const config obj equals to the whole thing that we just copied over, and just make sure that everything looks fine, and we're gonna export it as the default option. And inside of our source directory, let's create a new directory called components, and under components we're going to create a stacked bar chart.js file, and this is going to be the class declaration file for our stack bar chart component. And we're going to first import the necessary dependencies. We're going to import React from React, and we're going to import, just looking at the official documentation of the Highcharts React official package, essentially we're just going to copy over these two lines. So remember, the Highcharts is coming from the React Highcharts that we have installed, and needless to say, we are importing the default export of Highcharts React official package. So now let's declare a class component. We can do export default class stacked bar chart and have it extend react.component. And essentially we're just going to do a render method, and it's going to throw an error if we don't have the return statement. And inside of the return statement we're going to copy over a portion of the documentation. And so the Highcharts props is pointing to Highcharts, which is once again the default export from the React Highcharts package. Currently throwing an error to us because we don't have any variable named options, and this options prop is the configuration object that is going to render the chart. So remember, we have just declared a configuration object in the utils folders. Now let's import that one. We're gonna do import config obj from, and you can see that WebStorm is so smart that as soon as we have just typed out the name of the variable that we want to import, it auto resolved the whole path for us. So now inside of options, let's delete this name and pass the config object that we want the chart to be rendered with. And now, after we have successfully declared our class component inside of app.js, let's try to use it. So we're going to do import stack bar charts, and once again you can see how convenient it is to work in WebStorm. And after we have imported the component, we're going to use it right here. And as we save the file and run the npm start script, you can see that it's bringing up the dev server, and voila, our stack bar chart is currently being rendered on the screen. Alright guys, so now that we have a stack bar chart instance on the screen on the browser, The next thing that we're going to do is that we're going to build our own custom legends buttons to replace these default ones. And for that to happen, let's try and first create a div element to act as a placeholder for us to populate it with the custom legend buttons in the future. So inside of this app component, let's try to create another div, and let's give the class name of, let's name it legend area, and let's give it some inner text so that we know where it is on the screen right now. And as you can see, it's appearing right beneath the chart component, which is where we would like it to be. And the gist of creating custom legends is that we're going to leverage the callback functionality that comes with the Highcharts React-Official library. What it is that we're going to define our own custom function, and when we create that Highcharts React instance, we're going to include our custom callback function to be included. After the chart has been created on the screen, our custom defined function will be executed as the callback, and whatever logic we have implemented inside of that function body is going to take effect. Alright, so now let's try to create a custom method, and let's name it Highcharts callback. You can really name this function however you want, but for the sake of clarity, I would like to call it Highcharts callback. And it's going to take an argument, which is the chart object. And let's for now just console log this chart object so that we know that our function has been passed as the callback function. So inside of the Highcharts React component, within the callback props, we're going to pass in our this.highcharts callback function. And we just want to include the function name instead of the function invocation. So now let's save it. And after the charts has been saved, if we go to the inspect element and look at the console, we can see that our callback function has been executed indeed. And now it's console logging our chart object onto the screen. And inside of this chart object, the property that we care the most about is chart.series. And if you look at the chart.series property, it's essentially an array holding all the data that is currently being mapped onto the screen. To even closely examine this series object inside of our callback function, let's try to print it out onto the console so that we can take a better look. So we're going to do console.log chart.series. And you can see that it's an array, and for each array it has a lot more properties. It has color, which is a property that we're going to use to signify the user, okay, this legend button, it corresponds to this kind of values. So inside of each of the index of the series array, we're going to need two properties, which is color and name. And just quickly putting something on the screen, we're going to use a for each method on the chart.series array. We're going to do an for each. So inside of the for each method, we're going to define an anonymous error function. And that error function is going to take two arguments, which is the item and the index of the item. And we're going to map each of the array index in form of a button and append it to the legend area div that we have created in the previous step. So let's use some vanilla JavaScript DOM element manipulation to create the effect. So we're just going to first create a button element. We're going to name it my button. and we're going to use the document.createElement method to create a button element. Now that we have this button created, we want the button to have a text content of the name property of the index of the series array. And moving one step forward, remember the default legends, they all have the corresponding colors of the different values that is being represented on the screen. So to achieve the same effect, we're going to give it a style of background color to have the items color property. And outside of the for each loop, let's grab the legend area div and hold it in a variable. So we're going to do legend area to have the same name for the sake of clarity, and we're going to do document.querySelector, and remember our class name is legend area. And at the bottom of our for each method's anonymous callback, we're going to append our just created my button element into the legend area by using the append child method. And now as we save the method, we can see that indeed we have 3 custom built legend buttons that have the corresponding names of the 3 individuals that we're keeping track of in the config object. And moreover, our custom built legend buttons, they all have the corresponding colors of the different colors representing the different values. Alright guys, so now that we have this very crude looking custom legends on the screen, the next thing we're going to do is that we're going to wire up the on-click functionalities that the default legends have onto our custom built legends, so that when we click on any of the individual names, that all the values that fall under this individual, it gets eliminated from the screen, and when we click on it again, it pops back up. And by doing this, and you can see that Highchart has some very nice built-in animations for the transition, and we can use the built-in legends to focus and isolate one individual at a time to really look at how values pertaining to this individual is being spreaded. And the method of doing that is going to be adding a on-click event listener to our button elements. And if we take a really good look at the series array from the chart object, if we console log it onto the screen, after the chart has been rendered and we inspect our console panel, you will find that there's a property called visible. And this property is really all we need to achieve this off and on toggle animation. So the gist of the operation is that when the visible is true, when we click on the button, we just want to set the visible to be false, and vice versa. We're going to attach a on-click event handler to our button element by using the add event listener method. And the first argument is going to be the event, which is going to be click, obviously. And the second argument is going to be the callback function. And we're going to write an anonymous error function. So the method of changing the visibility of a certain individual's pertaining data from the screen is through a method exposed to us called setVisible. And since all we want to do is to toggle the visibility of a particular item, we're going to do item.setVisible, and inside of it we just want to set the value to the opposite of what is currently being held at the item's visible property. So we're going to do not item.visible. And after we have done that, we're going to save the code and let's test out the functionality. It looks like everything is working fine. And notice that whereas the default custom legend has the behavior of graying out as we have toggled the visibility of the individual's data to be off, and our current custom build legend doesn't have this behavior. So now let's try to implement that. And we're going to control that by setting the opacity property of our my button element. And we're going to implement that logic still within this anonymous callback function of the onClick event listener. So now first let's try to examine the opacity of the my button element. And I can tell you right off the bat, without us setting anything, all the opacity values of our custom legend buttons are all set to empty string. So we're going to do if my button dot style dot opacity equals to empty string, which means that this button has been clicked before, and that means that when we click on a button that hasn't been clicked on before, we want it to be grayed out. So we're going to do my button dot style dot opacity equals to 0.3, and we can test the behavior. And now let's implement the logic where when we click on it again, the transparency of this button is being brought back to 100%. So let's try to write another if block. So else if my button dot style dot opacity equals to 0.3 as a string, we want my button dot style dot opacity to be set to 1. And you can see that this behavior is working. But now our problem is, after the transparency of the button has been brought back to 100%, when we click on it again, we want the opacity to be dropped to 0.3 again. We can potentially nest another else if statement. So if my button dot style dot opacity equals to 1 this time, we're gonna do my button dot style dot opacity to be, guess what, 0.3. So now I believe the button is going to behave exactly the way we want it to be. You can potentially clean up this block of code to be a switch statement, but this code is just for the sake of demonstration, and as long as the code serves the purpose, I don't really care for the clarity of the syntax or whatever. So now let's try to make the buttons look a little more aesthetic. Alright, so I have went ahead and converted our if statements into a nice looking switch statement. And what we're going to do next is to try to make our custom build legend buttons to look a little more nicer. So we're going to place our editor and our browser side by side so we can have a better look at what's going on. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to delete this I'm the legend area text to make more room for our custom legend buttons. And right now they're all looking very timid and small, and so the next objective we're going to do is to make the buttons taller and wider. So under the same logic where when we're setting the text content and the background color, we're going to give my button a height of maybe 25 pixels. Okay, sorry, it should be an equal operator. You can see that it's just grew a little bit, and by the same token, let's give it a width maybe 100 pixels. You can see that the border of the button is a little bit hazy. We don't appreciate that, so let's set the border attribute of my button to be none, which looks much cleaner. And now, as you can see, all the three buttons are very tightly squished against each other. We want the buttons to have some space in between, and we can leverage the index argument that we have included in this callback function. So we're going to do if index is greater than 0, meaning that if the button is either Jane or Joe, we're going to give my button style object a margin left of 16 pixels. Yeah, looks much nicer. And by the same token, you can see that when we're having a black text color on a very dark color, in this case it's the dark gray, the visibility is very low. It's extremely hard for us to see. So the way that we're supposed to handle this is that we're supposed to calculate the luminance value of this color. Remember, for each color we have three values. We have hue, saturation, and luminance. When the luminance is lower, and I typically set the logic condition to be when the luminance is lower than 50% or 0.5, I will set the color of the text to be white so that the user can easily read the text when it's being placed against a very dark color. But for the sake of this video, I don't really want to get into that calculating the luminance value of a color logic. So all we're going to do is that if the index is 1, meaning that if our button is Jane, which has a very dark gray color, we want the color of the text to be set to white. And as you can see, now we can read the text much better. And now we have our own custom legend control buttons. The next thing that I really want to do is to disable the default legend buttons. And we're going to do that by going to the configuration object and go to the plot options. And because our graph is a bar chart, we're going to target the bar object. And we're going to set the show in legend to be false. And as you can see, after we have resaved our configuration object, we have successfully disabled the default legend buttons. Alright guys, so that's all I have to say in today's video. For those who are interested, I will be throwing today's code onto my personal GitHub page and leave a link down below so that you can play with the code. When it comes to data visualization, especially when it comes to things related to visualizing data in the form of charts, I really prefer to use this Highcharts library than the C3D3 library, because I think modifying and passing configuration object to modify the look of a chart is much more easier than using the the jQuery like syntax, which is something that C3 and D3 is using. Alright guys, I hope you found this video to be informative. Please give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more JavaScript related content. With that said, I will see all of you in next week's video. Bye bye.